Hi, I'm Dylan Paris. I'm a musician and a video creator. I work in technology, and in my spare time I like to make videos about music and technology, and often music technology, where the two intersect. Today I want to talk about why I chose the Gigabyte Aero 15 XC model as my primary computer for music production. For the last couple months, it's been my main machine for video editing, music production, and gaming. And that last bit is kind of why I'm stuck in the world of PCs. If you've been keeping track of computers lately, especially laptops, you probably know that Apple is absolutely killing the game when it comes to processors, when it comes to fan noise, battery life, all that stuff. About 10 years ago, if a normal person asked you, what laptop should I buy? The answer was the Macbook Air for most people. But over the course of the last 10 years, Apple kind of lost their way. Windows PC manufacturers really stepped ahead in a lot of ways, and you start having competitors like Dell, Lenovo, Microsoft themselves with the Surface Pro and the Surface laptop, and more niche creator laptops like Razer and Gigabyte. However, in the last year, Apple unleashed their M1 processor onto the world of personal computers, and it really radically changed the game in a lot of ways for what computer you would recommend for most people. If you're not doing any gaming, then the obvious answer for what computer should I get is an M1 MacBook Air or an M1 MacBook Pro. And the only difference there is, do you need a brighter screen and do you need extended workload processing? So you might be asking, well, why do I have this Gigabyte Aero 15 and not one of these M1 MacBooks if I love them so much? And the answer is money, honestly. If I could afford anything in the world and anything I wanted, I would just have both. But I try to be pretty budget conscious. You may have noticed that on the channel. I try to buy older phones. I try to buy used or cheaper tech. And this computer is by no means cheap in the traditional sense, but it is way cheaper than equivalent MacBook Pros were. Because right now there isn't really a MacBook Pro that has all of what this has, except for the 16-inch. And when you get into spec for spec matching with the 16-inch, you still lose a couple of things. One, this laptop has an OLED display. Now that can actually be a pro or a con, depending on who you ask. It's a pro for content consumption. You almost can't argue that. Things look amazing on the OLED, especially in 4K. Where it might be a con, and where I even have some concerns about it, are that OLEDs can have a risk of burn-in. Now I've had OLED phones for years, and I've never seen burn-in myself, but it's something people are worried about. And I do actually use a fair number of apps that have static graphic user interfaces, or GUIs. Specifically, Ableton Live Suite is my #1 music app of choice. Now I run it in a pretty dark mode, but I still get worried that the UI might someday burn into the screen. So that's kind of a con. However, when editing 4K videos, when playing back media, when editing photos and the thumbnails for this channel, and when playing games in 4K, which you can do with this laptop, the OLED really shines. And really, games. I know this is a video about music production, but I think games are the central important piece here. If I was looking for a single machine and I didn't play games on my computer, I would get a MacBook. I have been really tempted to get a refurbished MacBook Pro M1. I'm waiting until June to see if they announce the rumored 14-inch with a better chip and potentially the XDR display, as well as the new 16-inch. But truthfully, if I'm trying to do the right thing for my budget and for my long-term goals with computing, I'm probably going to stick with this Aero 15. And sticking with the Aero 15 has its ups and downs. If you've been using computers for music production for a while, then what I'm about to say is probably not news to you. But it's worth noting for anyone who's getting into this or hasn't checked in a while. Windows does not have the same kind of native real-time audio drivers that Mac does. The Mac has what's called the core audio driver. And this means that when you're using different music production software, your latency is super low and it's able to process sound very quickly, even out of just the headphone jack built into your Mac. That is not the same out-of-the-box experience you're getting with Windows. In the world of Windows, you're dealing with MME drivers and other OEM drivers. All these machines are not made by one company creating most of the components and designing it. Most of these machines, even really nice ones like the Gigabyte Aero, are using an amalgam of off-the-shelf parts customized and put into a frame. And that can actually be fine for most use cases, especially gaming, especially productivity, but where it really falls short is audio. Specifically, out-of-the-box audio drivers on Windows. They're garbage and you can't trust them for music production. Now you might be saying, well, if that's true, why would you ever buy a Windows machine for music production? And the reason you would do that is because you can augment the terrible built-in audio experience with an audio interface. I very recently bought this Audient ID14 Mark II. I did a fair amount of research on audio interfaces and tried to figure out which one made the most sense for me. Before the Audient, I was using this Complete Audio 6 Mark I, the original version of Native Instruments audio interface. Now, when I switched to the Audient, I thought that my core failure point in music production on this device was the Complete Audio 6. I think the Complete Audio 6 was introducing some issues. This is a device that has been replaced by a successor. It's a device that hasn't had a substantial firmware update in many years, as many versions of Windows have come and gone. And so I do think it was introducing latency and audio crackling into my workflow. However, it's not the only culprit, because something you have to deal with in Windows world that you don't have to deal with quite as much in Mac world. And there are trade-offs, but a point in Mac's favor is that you're constantly juggling drivers on a Windows machine. Audio drivers, graphics drivers, Wi-Fi card drivers, processor drivers, BIOS updates. All of these things you never think about on a Mac, for better or worse, and in this case worse. You have to think about a lot on a Windows machine. Now the trade-off is kind of obvious. Until the introduction of the M1, and especially still in the high-end creator space, you are gonna get more bang for your buck with a PC. But the huge caveat here is that really is only true if you're gaming now. Because if you don't need a major graphics processor, and if you don't need the ability to run Windows to play Steam and Epic and Itch and GOG games that only run on PC, then the M1 processor, especially in single core performance, actually wipes the floor with this thing. And any M2 or M1X that might come out seems like it's gonna perform the killing blow on this guy. If I was just buying a machine just for music production and just for video editing right now, I would get an M1 MacBook Pro 13-inch. And honestly, I would actually say stand by and wait and see what we see at WWDC, because if they do introduce a redesigned 14-inch or a 16-inch with M1 hardware, or M2 or M1X, especially if they add an XDR display, that machine would be extremely tempting. If I could go back in time, I would probably keep my gaming desktop I had and just get an M1 laptop. Separate my Windows experience from my Mac experience, but I can't. I sold my desktop at a very, very cheap price to my ex-girlfriend because I wanted her to have a cool way to play video games. I stand by that, no regrets, but because of that, I ended up buying this laptop to consolidate all of my processing, video gaming, video editing, music production into one machine. And there are ways in which it really is a dream machine, and there are ways in which it's kind of a nightmare. Things like waking from sleep on this computer will start to introduce latency and processing delays in ways that just don't make sense. Like if I was playing a game and then I close the game and then I close the lid on my laptop and reopen it in an hour or two, load that same game up, I start seeing stuttering. So I restart it and then it's fine. And I thought, okay, well, that's just for games. I can live with that. However, an even worse version of that happens in Ableton, where if I was working in music, save the file, close Ableton, close the lid, reopen from sleep, reopen Ableton, it starts CPU spiking and crackling and freaking out with way less going on than what it was doing before it went to sleep. It's like the processor never actually comes back to full power and instead stays in some kind of power saving mode, even if you manually increase CPU to 100%, manually change power plan to performance, manually boost the CPU in the OEM software center. And if what I'm talking about sounds almost like gibberish, you're probably a Mac user and you're probably not worrying about any of this. And so again, the question becomes, well, why even stick with this? And in my head, it's not just a potentially sunk cost fallacy thing. Right now, it's pretty impossible to get an RTX 3070 or 3080, and even the laptops that have them are pretty rare, especially the nice ones like this. I paid $2,200 for this machine. It has 32 gigabytes of RAM, an i7 processor, which is honestly kind of its weak point. I would prefer Ryzen, but so would everyone in the year 2021. It's got an RTX 3070, which is a Max-Q variant, but for you nerds out there, it actually can boost up to 105 watts. As long as the CPU isn't taking too many resources. So because of that, it is a little more powerful than your traditional Max-Q variant, but that's extra nerdy for my gaming nerds out there. This machine, just for gaming, absolutely shreds. For video editing, it's got some of the best export times I've ever seen. I can edit videos that are 20 minutes long in Adobe Premiere and export them out in like 4 or 5 minutes. The actual choking point of my video pipeline now is YouTube's HD processing and their ad checking. Every other step of the way, I'm faster now than what YouTube can do in their processing timeline, except maybe the actual shooting and editing process. So you're gonna hear some fan noise from this thing, and that's another trade-off. Especially compared to the M1 Max, and especially the MacBook Air, there's just a dramatically higher amount of fan noise on this thing. The MacBook Air doesn't even have a fan, and the MacBook Pro, the M1 model again, does have a fan, but it rarely kicks in, except in extended workloads. You can see this thing is taking a while to turn on, and that's because I've started having it go to hibernate instead of sleep, because I'm trying to see if that resolves the wake from sleep issue I was talking about. Another big con with this machine is the fingerprint sensor, right here. Now, if you've ever used a Mac fingerprint sensor, getting into your computer is excessively easy. I am not kidding when I say that the success rate on this thing was like 30%. This fingerprint scanner is so bad that I've disabled Windows Hello fingerprint login and am just using a PIN code again, even though they took a chunk out of the trackpad to put a fingerprint sensor here. It's not worth it, and it's really bad. And honestly, you can tell that's where they cut corners. Now, I do want to show the design of this thing because it's actually pretty svelte. You know, for what it can do, this is actually a really nice thin and light design. Now, thin and light is relative, but I mean, a computer that could do this 5 years ago probably doesn't exist, but assuming it did, it would be a giant desktop. Part of that is just the advancements in graphics technology, and part of that is the hard work of developers and manufacturers like Gigabyte creating thinner and lighter profiles of powerful machines. This machine would be perfect if it didn't have so many issues. And I have oscillated between PC and Mac many times because of stuff like this. Every time I'm with a PC, some kind of driver breaks, some kind of CPU crackles, something, the keyboard driver double taps a key, rolling back that driver messes with graphics, and now Star Wars Battlefront has a rainbow background, and you're like, how is any of this connected? I work in IT, and so I understand that things are very intricate, that troubleshooting often finds root causes somewhere completely different. But things like driver updates and incompatibilities with hardware and software, stuff like that, are much rarer on Macs. Even with the change to the M1, and even with the compatibility issues in Big Sur. That's maybe the closest the Mac has been to being this kind of complex in a while. But because it's Apple and because they're moving all their computers there, it's a temporary complexity issue that isn't going to last as long and be a forever thing the way Windows updates constantly are. I have to be in horror and terror and shock of what kind of update from what kind of manufacturer or what kind of OS update is going to do something new to this machine that I paid a lot of money for and potentially break its ability to do music. If you've been following this channel for a while, you know I have a lot of problems with a lot of manufacturers when it comes to music stuff because it really feels like musicians are left by the wayside. I'm actually kind of hopeful about Apple right now. They've got Logic running on the M1. They've got the M1 coming to iPads. I hope by the time you watch this, if it's been a year, you'll be able to run Logic on an iPad. There could be a reality in which an $800 iPad Pro smokes this computer in a couple different workflows. We're not quite there yet, but I'm very fascinated by what the future holds there, and that's for a different video. But in the meantime, the question remains, am I going to keep this thing? Am I going to switch to Apple? Am I going to just buy an OEM built desktop so I can have games at a reasonable price? Am I going to wait until the market finally comes down in 3 years and I can buy an RTX 3070 for MSRP? I can't give you that answer because I don't entirely know. What I can say is I've been trying really hard to make this thing work, and when it works, it's really cool. It is really cool to have a machine that compact, that powerful, a display that nice. When audio is coming out of this and I'm emulating classic Korg and Roland and all kinds of different sound effects using Arturia's V collection and Pigments, Native Instruments Complete, Valhalla Reverb, and the internal Ableton instruments and effects suites, when all of this is coming together, it's amazing. But it's a Windows machine, and so there's always some kind of caveat, and there's always some kind of headache. And the question for me is, are the headaches worse than they would be on an M1 Mac, or an M2 Mac, or an M1X, or whatever they call it? And would I grievously miss what I would lose if I switched over? Which is mostly just gaming performance. And I believe Massive X from Native Instruments so far is still not running on Big Sur, specifically on the M1. I don't know. I'm constantly debating it. Because the thing is, PCs also don't retain value anywhere near as well as a Mac does, which is frustrating. But because of that, if I do decide I want to get rid of this thing, I kind of have to do it soon. Because right now, you cannot buy this machine. At least as of the time I last looked, within the last few days, you can't buy this laptop for this price. Which means I could probably sell it and get most of what I paid for it back. I don't want to scalp, I'm not really about that life. But I could recoup a lot of value now that I probably wouldn't be able to in the future. But I don't know how much I'd miss it if I did, because there are pros. So I would say subscribe if you want to see what happens next. I'm not keeping anything from you. I'm just playing this by ear. I've got some music on Spotify under my name, Dylan Paris. I'd be super stoked if you checked out my album and considered following me there. If you enjoyed this video, give it a thumbs up. If you hated this video, give it a thumbs down. I would love to know about your experiences with Windows or Macs and music production, and what parts are the coolest for you and what parts are the worst. So tell me about that stuff in the comments below. If you're a routine viewer, you know I love to comment back and engage in the comments. I'm always there. I've got no life, so I'll catch you there, and I'll see you next time. Thanks for watching. Peace.